Большое спасибо за приглашение. То есть Амиран и Европейский университет, и тоже Ереван. Я часто бывала на Кавказе, но сейчас первый раз в Ереване. И это большое удовольствие. То есть спасибо за гостеприимство. Во-вторых, к сожалению, мой доклад будет на английском, потому что мой русский язык не, по-моему, достаточно, чтобы объяснить все. Я очень надеюсь, что все будет ясно для вас. Если нет вопросов, пожалуйста. Спасибо. И в-третьих, как я могу это объяснить? Вы должны знать, что я очень хорошо понимаю, что я маленький, скромный историк из Нидерландов. И здесь я в компании очень сильных ученых, сильных кавказоведов. И у меня нет претензия, амбиция вам объяснить, что такая историография в Советском Союзе. Ну ладно, давай начнем. То есть, the title of my presentation is, as you said already, Myth-Making and Nation-Building, Ziia Buniiatov and the Construction of the Azerbaijani Past. Is it there? No. Well, it's actually more or less an overview of my book, which was published last summer, a few months ago. And the main topic is, of this book is the role of historians and Orientalists with regard to nation building in Soviet and post-Soviet Azerbaijan, roughly between the 1950s and 1990s. And my main antagonist is the historian, Orientalist, hero of the Soviet Union, and also very actually admired member of society in Azerbaijan, Ziia Buniiatov. Many of you might know him if you are at least older than 40 or 50 perhaps. Anyway, he was born in 1923 in Astara, it's in the south of Azerbaijan, and he was assassinated in Baku in 1997. And he is considered to be the founding father of a historical canon for the Azerbaijani people. So in fact, he functions for me as a kind of case study. So he is the one that had to provide Azerbaijan with a solid position in the ongoing competition with neighboring Armenia over the past. And perhaps even more important, over certain territorial claims. So overall, I aimed to analyze the function of Buniatov's publications for Azerbaijani society in general and for historiography in particular. And what was more and more interesting for me was the process of myth-making around his work and also around his person. So I intended to map the development of his discourse from the 1950s onwards and also the relation to the socio-political events in that period, such as growing nationalism, independence in 1991, and the conflict with Armenia. So important questions were, what was, and maybe even still is, the political significance of Buniatov's newly constructed historical canon? And also I asked myself the question, what was the interaction between the heroic image of Buniatov and the mythological past he invented and modern, so the current Azerbaijani identity? And what is the interaction between national identity and that personal image of Buniatov? Well, first, maybe it's good to give a kind of overview of the broader context, Soviet Oriental studies and historiography in general. In the USSR, history writing was very, very important for the creation of Soviet nations, and actually also for the legitimacy of the Union republics. And in the case of Central Asia and the Caucasus, the study of history was strongly linked to the discipline of Oriental studies. Historians retrieve, maintain, and sometimes actively produce the memories that feed national sentiment. Nation building was, and it still is, a crucial ambition for historians, and the construction of a strong collective identity is an important pillar of this process of nation building. And this identity is reflected, for instance, in the image of national heroes. So historical personalities are turned into mythological icons that can shape national identity. What was very interesting in my research is that my, let's say, historian and Orientalist Buniiatov not only produced national myth, also his own image obtained mythological proportions. I will talk about that later. And thus, he became both the subject and the object of this whole process. Now let's look at the early Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks were confronted with the problem of nationalism. Stalin, as the Commissar of Nationalities, was responsible for organizing the emerging USSR into national units. And his concept of the Union republics as national in form and socialist in content, that concept had to facilitate a process of modernization and secularization, and finally, of course, Sovietization. And state support for national identities was also crucial to avoid an impression of being simply another colonizer, imperial suppressor. And according to Stalin, I quote him here, a nation is a historically constituted community of people. And key factors, according to Stalin, were key factors to define a nation were a common economy, language, culture, territory, and history. Well, this is actually a rather modernist view, which gave space to an active and very conscious also state intrusion to formulate and shape all the various national identities. Important for our context is the strong emphasis on a common history as a key marker for the nation. And exactly this turned history into a highly politicized discipline. And this makes also history not so much the product of the past, but rather an answer to the demands of today and tomorrow. One important element in this context was the fact that all titular nations were supposed to have great traditions. Well, if necessary, we had to invent great traditions. A key issue for a certain nation to obtain the privilege of having an own territory was the historical evidence of being indigenous. And this brought the concept of being rooted in a certain territory to the utmost political importance, of course. Another important element was the ethnogenesis of a nation. This could be defined as a narrative of ethnic roots, and for instance, of the glorious life of remote ancestors that have a direct link with the present. And this resulted in the prestigious role of historians as architects and myth makers of a nation. Although the invention of a glorious past and the creation of national identity were actually designed as very effective instruments for Sovietization, they also had a certain danger. Historians could use it, for instance, in competition with neighboring nations. And here the party line changed several times, and periods of support for national history writing were interchanging with also periods of more repression. And Soviet historians finally laid the foundations not only for national identity, but over time also for ethnic conflicts that eventually undermined the USSR. Now let's have a short look at the biography of our hero, Ziia Buniiatov. As I said, he's born in 1923, by the way, exactly the same year as his friend now and then, yes, Geidar Aliyev. He was also born in 1923. Ziia Buniiatov was born near the Iranian border. And, he would become a classic example of a Soviet scholar in the periphery, who always had to operate between the ideological demands of Moscow and of the demands of Azerbaijani nationalism. So, and exactly this makes him so interesting for my research. And his personality is full of contradictions. And I would argue that the production of his heroic image was a joint effort of himself, his widow, and the Institute of Oriental Studies of Vostokovedenie in Baku, the institute of which he was for many, many years the director. And this heroic image is very often at odds with the memory of colleagues, former students, friends or enemies or other contemporaries who very often challenged actually this constructed iconic picture. So for me, interviewing all those people was a very important element of my research, very interesting. One of my goals was to deconstruct this mythological image in order to understand the function of this myth and the function and the significance for national identity in Azerbaijan. So when Buniiatov was born exactly now a century ago, the Soviet Union was still a very recent establishment, and his family background reflects actually the ethnic complexity that is so very typical for the Caucasus. His father, Musa, he was actually from a Talish family, so Persian speaking, and he was allegedly a descendant of famous Muslim sheikhs from Bibi Heibat, which is near a mosque near Baku, which gave the father a very special status among the population because these sheikhs from Bibi Heibat were considered to be morally superior, so not to say holy people. And besides this religious status, this father also was a military man. He had served in the Tsarist army during the First World War. Then he sided with the Bolsheviks in the Civil War, and after the Civil War, he continued to work for the Red Army as a military interpreter. And Zia's mother, Raisa Gusanova, she was born into a family of Russian old believers. So this gave Ziia Buniiatov a very complex ethnic and also religious background and a multilingual upbringing. His first language was Russian, second language was Azeri, and the third language was Arabic, which was taught, his father taught him the language of the Quran. So in the late 1930s, Buniiatov decided to follow the example of his father. He entered the military academy of Baku, and he explains this with the following words. Now I quote him. Since my early childhood, I felt like a soldier. I was raised with respect for everyone connected to the army, and the whole atmosphere of society was self-sacrificing with a spirit of patriotism, because our country was surrounded by enemies. Strong capitalist powers were prepared to destroy the Soviet Union. So to me, a military education was self-evident. So far, Buniiatov. And then in the summer of 41, he was enrolled as an officer in the Red Army. and his baptism of fire took place in Bessarabia, nowadays in Moldova. And at the end of the war, in 1944, he was transferred to the notorious Strafneubataillon, Strafbad, which was actually kind of a panel battalion for criminals or people who, let's say, violators of military discipline. And so this already has a kind of mythological status, but as one can conclude from Buniatov's own account, which you can see in an interview on YouTube, for instance, he explains that he was not a simple soldier in the Strafbad. He was actually a commander of the troops who had to send his soldiers to the front every day. At the end of the war, he was decorated with the highest possible award. He was Герой Советского Союза, so hero of the Soviet Union, and this certainly gave him a certain immunity after the war, this status. Well, in 1946, he enters the Moscow Institute of Oriental Studies, the MIF, because he decided to become an Arabist, just like his father. And that MIF was a very prestigious, highly politicized party school of Oriental Studies. And under the supervision of the famous, many of you might know him, Arabist Yevgeny Belyaev, he wrote his Kandidatskaya on Italian imperialism in 1954. And this topic was very much in line with the Soviet discourse of the 1950s, because then the study of Western colonialism was very fashionable in the 50s. Well, after this first success, he decided to switch completely his focus from modern Oriental studies. He decided to focus on the ancient history of his own nation. So for this reason, he continued his research at the Leningrad branch of the Institute of Oriental Studies. And this new research is completely devoted to ancient and medieval history of his home country, Azerbaijan. He defends his Doktorskaya in 1965. It's called Azerbaijan in the 7th to 9th century. And he's immediately appointed professor at what is now the BGU, the State University of Baku. And he's also appointed, not yet a director, but he will be part of the Institute of Oriental Studies of Baku. Of the Academy of Sciences. So this was the beginning of a glorious career. He's elected full member of the Academy a few years later, and he will be director for many, many years of the Institute of Oriental Studies. Now let's have a look at his work and why is it so significant for Azerbaijan? Well, right from the very beginning, the late 1950s, Buniatov challenged what was regarded as a foreign, so alien, and imposed historical canon of Azerbaijan. The fact that this canon actually had been created by mainly Russian, Armenian, Jewish, sometimes historians, had led to misinterpretations of, according to Buniatov, of the Azerbaijani ancient past. Generally, the Azerbaijani people had been considered to be newcomers in the region. And what was perhaps even worse, they were considered to be former nomads that lacked a glorious history or a great national culture, unlike, for instance, the Georgian or the Armenian neighbors. And these were Buniatov's main challenges, and actually he started to address them systematically from the late 1950s until the late 1980s. In his very first article, published in 1958, he engaged with one of the most urgent issues, the historical legitimization of the territory of the Azerbaijani SSR. And that question of territory always was central in his works. And Buniatov even gradually established his own school of scholars that would continue his work in this respect. So a second issue of importance relates to his attempts to work with Armenian chronicles. According to Buniatov, the most prominent of these ancient chronicles were actually originally written in the Albanian language. And by proving this, he kills several birds with one stone. In the first place, he proves that ancient Albanian, what is according to him the same as Azerbaijani, that ancient Albanian culture was as highly developed as the Armenian culture, so with an own language, a script, and historiography. Secondly, he unmasked the Armenian neighbors also as conspirators by arguing that ancient Albania was incorporated into the Armenian culture as a result of a deal between Armenian and Arab leaders in the early Middle Ages. So in other words, the Albanians actually became Armenians, but were actually Albanians without realizing it. That is the logic behind this. A third issue is related to the very persistent idea that Azerbaijanis were newcomers in the region. And by claiming a direct link between ancient Albania and modern Azerbaijan, Buniatov, of course, provided his country with millennia-old roots in the Caucasus. And he provided his nation with an ethnogenesis that went back to long before the massive arrival of Turkic tribes of the 12th century. So thanks to Buniatov, Albania was no longer an almost mythical state that had disappeared God knows when in medieval times. According to him, the country and the nation had survived in spite of the fact that the language, religion, or any other markers of identity had vanished over the centuries. So in spite of Buniatov's clearly nationalist mission, he always operated within the Soviet framework. So his focus on ancient history was always more or less in line with Moscow. Buniatov was careful enough to not discuss taboo topics such as 19th century mass migrations of Armenians from Iran or the Ottoman Empire to the Caucasus or to Nagorno-Karabakh, for instance, or the pogroms between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the early 20th century. That was taboo. Only during Gorbachev's perestroika, these old taboos were broken. And this is the period when the old narrative quickly starts to shift. So, and this brings me to the last section, the period of perestroika, and then the escalating conflict with Armenia, and then independence. So the late 1980s are really a turning point. The escalation of the Karabakh conflict, especially after the Sumgait pogroms that happened in early 1988, were a watershed for the whole Soviet Union. Already since the late 1950s, Buniatov was actually perceived as the ideal person to counterbalance Armenian territorial aspirations. And this significance, of course, would rapidly increase in the 1980s. And Buniatov's old style of writing, which had been, in spite of the political significance, rather academic, now drastically changed. And one of the first examples of this new style is his infamous article, Why Sumgait, which was written as an answer to the Sumgait pogroms of 1988. Buniatov here in this article presents the Armenian population of this gloomy industrial town near Baku as responsible for the pogroms. According to Buniatov, the Armenians are openly undermining the most important dogma of Soviet beliefs, which is the idea of the friendship of the peoples. In spite of the fact that many Armenians got killed during these pogroms, Azerbaijan sees itself as the victim of a growing Armenian nationalism. And this was due also due to the fact that many Azerbaijanis had been expelled already from Nagorno-Karabakh since the end of '87. So it is understandable in a way. More than ever, now in the late 80s, Buniatov is seen as the hero scholar that can and will defend his nation against Armenian aggression. So this new political situation also requires a new discourse with regard to the past. And now topics that had been taboo earlier, such as the clashes between Azerbaijanis and Armenians in the early 20th century, but also Stalin's terror, for instance, or the repression of religion, those topics suddenly turn into important markers of a new national identity. And Buniatov, who had been the creator of the Soviet canon, now adapts this old, actually, wisdom and experience to new political challenges. For instance, he publishes what is allegedly the first Azeri translation of the Quran. Although he always was a very convinced communist atheist, now he starts to behave like, a great specialist on Islam. Another topic that was introduced by Buniatov was the significance of Armenian enmity as a very strong factor of social cohesion. Because according to Buniatov, the Armenian nation had two very strong issues on which their identity was based. First, a very strong construction of the past, and second, the genocide memories that created an image of eternal victim. Buniatov copied this Armenian model for his native Azerbaijan. What he actually did was he created exactly a kind of mirroring, same image of being the eternal victim as one of the main markers of Azerbaijani collective memory and collective identity. And actually this image is very much still alive in spite of the fact that after the Second Karabakh War, the situation completely changed. So this brings me to a conclusion. And well, because of the time, maybe I should make that a bit shorter. Anyway, one of the main topics of this study was the interaction between politics and history writing. And I did not have the ambition, of course, to write again some new other version of Azerbaijani past. It was actually an attempt for me to investigate the interconnection between scholarship, nationalism, and politics. And what was extremely interesting for me, this book is actually the follow-up of my doctor's dissertation, which I defended in 2019, in October, exactly 4 years ago. And the many heated reactions that I received within 24 hours after my defense told me that it's actually a very interesting topic indeed, and very much alive in the region. So the first reactions came from Armenia. Within 12 hours, I found dozens of reviews on the internet. It was impossible that anyone would have read my book at all, but very enthusiastic reviews saying that, wonderful, someone at the very good university in Western Europe unmasks the historiography of Azerbaijan as a collection of pure falsifications, which was, of course, not what I intended before, so it made me rather sad. Well, one day later, Azerbaijan started to react, partly due to Armenian reactions. And so first, there was a kind of less academic hate mail the first weeks. And then academia woke up and they started to write reviews. And the content of these reviews is actually very interesting indeed. So what was I believe, very painful was, for instance, the fact that I took into question the status of first of all, hero and historian Ziia Buniatov, and secondly, also the status of a nation with a perhaps disputed past, and finally also the competition with Armenia. So whereas that was absolutely not my intention, my intention was to analyze the work of Buniatov, not as a falsificator or some kind of charlatan, and I believe, by the way, it's not unique for Azerbaijan that historiography is politicized. It's probably not different in Armenia or in my own country in the Netherlands. Only what I wanted to do was to analyze a scholar as someone who has to maneuver within a certain political context. But obviously, it is maybe still too early. So anyway, it brings us to maybe a sad conclusion. Anyway, what is very important here is I think that, and for this I want to thank this conference. This is really my last sentence, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for this conference, because creating conditions that strengthen a dialogue is actually the only long-term answer. So for this reason, these kind of conferences are very important. And we don't need for this armies or, power-hungry politicians, but we need good education, scholars, artists, etc. Thank you for your attention.